I arrived at my brother Jake's 30th birthday party with a carefully wrapped gift expecting a normal family celebration. My mother, Patricia, saw me walking through the front door and loudly announced to the entire room full of relatives and friends, "Oh, you weren't on the guest list. Must have been a mistake." Every conversation stopped. All eyes turned to stare at me standing frozen in the doorway, gift in hand. I quietly set the present on the kitchen counter without saying a word and walked out, feeling the weight of 30 pairs of judgmental eyes following my exit. Sitting in my car in the parking lot, my hands shook with rage and humiliation. 28 years of life. And this was how my adoptive mother chose to treat me in front of our entire family. But this wasn't just about tonight. This public humiliation was the final straw in nearly 3 decades of systematic abuse and exclusion that had defined my existence in the Morrison household. The memories came flooding back as I gripped my steering wheel. Birthdays forgotten while Jake's were elaborate celebrations with dozens of guests. Christmas mornings where Jake unwrapped pile after pile of expensive presents while I received a single generic gift card. Family vacations to Disney World and Hawaii that I mysteriously never got invited to because there wasn't enough room, or the timing didn't work out. I was adopted at age 3 after my biological parents died in what everyone called a tragic car accident. Patricia and Gerald Morrison had been family friends who stepped in to take care of the orphan child out of the goodness of their hearts. At least that's the story everyone believed. What the extended family didn't know was how differently I was treated behind closed doors. While Jake got his college tuition paid in full, I worked 3 different jobs to afford community college. When Jake wanted to buy his first car, Gerald co-signed a loan for a brand new truck. When I needed transportation to get to my jobs, I was told to save up and figure it out myself. I rode the bus for 2 years until I could afford a beat-up Honda with 150,000 miles on it. The family construction business had always been described as something both Jake and I would inherit. Morrison and Sons Construction would become Morrison and Children Construction. Gerald used to joke when we were younger, but when Jake turned 25, suddenly the paperwork showed him as the sole heir. When I asked about the change, Patricia told me I was being ungrateful and presumptuous for expecting to inherit a business I'd never contributed to. The biggest betrayal came 2 years ago when I discovered what they'd done to my biological parents' legacy. My birth parents, Rebecca and Michael Chen, had established a trust fund for my education and future. For 25 years, I believed that money had been used for my care and upbringing. The reality was far more sinister. Patricia and Gerald had been systematically stealing from that trust fund since I was 4 years old. They'd used my inheritance money to pay for Jake's private school education, his sports equipment, his summer camps, and eventually his college tuition. The account that should have contained nearly $150,000 had been drained to less than $3,000 by the time I turned 18. I only discovered this theft because of a chance encounter with an old bank employee who remembered my case. She mentioned how unusual it was that my guardians had requested so many early withdrawals from the trust account. That conversation led me to hire a lawyer and investigate the financial records. What I found destroyed any remaining hope I had for this family. But the financial theft wasn't the worst part. 2 years ago, I'd started recording conversations with Patricia and Gerald, hoping to get them to admit what they'd done. I wasn't prepared for what else I would capture on those recordings. Patricia's voice echoed in my memory from a conversation I'd recorded 6 months ago. She should be grateful we even kept her. Do you know how much trouble it would have saved us if we'd just let social services take her? But no, we did the noble thing and look how she repays us. Always asking questions, always making demands. Her real parents were just as entitled and selfish. Maybe it runs in her blood. Gerald's laughter on that recording still made my stomach turn. At least we got some use out of the money they left her. Jake's education was expensive, but it was worth it. She'll never amount to anything anyway. We saved that money from being wasted. But the most damning part of that recording was what came next. Patricia had started coaching Jake on what to tell relatives about my behavior and character. If anyone asks why Cecelia doesn't come to family events, just tell them she's been having problems. Mental health issues, drug problems, whatever sounds believable. The important thing is that they understand she's the one choosing to stay away from the family. For 2 years, I'd carried this recording like a weight in my chest. I'd consulted with lawyers about pressing charges, but the statute of limitations on the financial crimes had expired. The only justice available to me was the truth. Tonight, as I sat in that parking lot with tears of rage streaming down my face, I realized I was done protecting people who had never protected me. I was done being the family secret, the inconvenient reminder of tragedy that everyone preferred to forget. I pulled out my phone and opened the video file I'd saved 2 years ago. My finger hovered over the upload button. Once I pressed it, there would be no going back. The Morrison family's reputation in our small Tennessee community would be destroyed. Jake's social life would implode. Patricia and Gerald's standing in their church and social circles would crumble. But maybe it was time for the truth to come out. I thought about all the family members inside that house who had been told lies about me for years. Cousins who thought I was unstable. Aunts and uncles who believed I was ungrateful. Family friends who had been told I was the problem child who caused nothing but drama and heartache. They deserved to know the truth, and I deserved to finally tell it. I pressed upload. The video uploaded to my social media account within minutes, but I didn't just post it without context. I spent the next hour writing a detailed explanation that laid out 25 years of systematic emotional abuse and financial theft. I included screenshots of bank records showing the depleted trust fund copies of the original trust documents that outlined how the money should have been used, and a timeline of every major family event I'd been excluded from over the years. The recording itself was devastating. Patricia's voice came through clearly as she admitted to taking my inheritance money and redistributing it to Jake. But what made the video truly explosive was the additional content I'd captured during that same conversation. Everyone thinks she's the problem child, Patricia's voice said on the recording. They don't know we took her money to pay for Jake's education. As far as the family is concerned, she's just the troubled adopted daughter who can't appreciate what she's been given. Gerald's voice could be heard agreeing and actually laughing about how easy it had been to fool our extended family. Marcus asked me last Christmas why Cecelia never comes to family gatherings anymore. I told him she'd been having drug problems and didn't want to be around the children. He bought it completely. The recording captured Patricia coaching Jake on specific lies to tell different relatives. If Emma asks, tell her Cecelia has been stealing money from us, and we had to cut her off for our own protection. If David brings her up, mention that she's been in and out of therapy for mental health issues. The key is to make them feel sorry for us, not her. But the most damaging part of the recording was when Patricia started talking about my biological parents. Rebecca always thought she was better than everyone else. Even in high school, she acted like she was too good for this town. Michael wasn't much better. They probably would have raised an entitled little princess anyway. At least we taught her some humility. Gerald's response chilled me to the bone. Sometimes I think that car accident was the best thing that could have happened to her. She never would have learned any real values living with those two. Within 30 minutes of posting, the comments started pouring in. Extended family members who hadn't spoken to me in years began expressing shock and outrage. Cousins, aunts, uncles and family friends started sharing their own pieces of the puzzle. My cousin Emma was the first to comment. "Cecelia, I am so sorry. Your parents told us you had asked them not to invite you to family events because you needed space. I've been respecting what I thought were your wishes for the past 5 years. I had no idea they were lying." Uncle Marcus posted a lengthy comment explaining how Patricia and Gerald had told him I was struggling with drug addiction and had specifically requested not to be included in family gatherings because I didn't want to be around the children. He'd been sending care packages to what he thought was a rehabilitation facility, but now realized the address they'd given him was just Patricia and Gerald's P.O. box. Aunt Susan revealed that she'd been told I was mentally unstable and potentially violent. Patricia told me Cecelia had threatened to hurt Jake if she wasn't given money. She said they were considering a restraining order. I've been scared to reach out because I thought you were dangerous. This is absolutely heartbreaking. Jake's longtime girlfriend Madison commented that she'd never been allowed to invite me to their social gatherings because Patricia had told her I was jealous of their relationship and had made threats against her. I always thought it was weird that Jake's sister was never around, but his parents made it sound like you were this volatile person who couldn't handle being around happy couples. The shares started multiplying rapidly. Family friends from church neighbors, business associates of Gerald's construction company, and community members who had known our family for decades were all seeing the truth for the first time. The comments section became a timeline of lies that Patricia and Gerald had told about me over the years. Mrs. Henderson from down the street revealed that Patricia had told her I'd been caught stealing from neighbors' houses and couldn't be trusted around other people's property. Coach Williams from the high school football team shared that Gerald had told him I'd been kicked out of college for cheating and drug use. The pastor from our family's church commented that Patricia had requested special prayers for my spiritual struggles and destructive behavior patterns. But the most shocking revelation came from Dr. Jennifer Reeves, our former family physician. She commented that Patricia had brought her falsified medical records claiming I had been diagnosed with various mental health disorders and personality defects. I always found it strange that these diagnoses came from doctors I'd never heard of and couldn't verify. Now I understand why. Within 2 hours, the post had been shared over 500 times. Local news reporter Angela Martinez reached out through private message, asking if I would be willing to speak on camera about my experience. But her message contained information that made my blood run cold. "Ms. Morrison, I've been following your story and I believe there's a much larger pattern here that you may not be aware of. Gerald Morrison's construction company has been under federal investigation for fraudulent billing practices involving military housing contracts. Your video provides crucial character evidence that investigators have been seeking. Would you be willing to speak with federal agents about your family's history of financial fraud?" I stared at my phone screen trying to process this information. The family business that had been too important for me to inherit was apparently built on criminal activity. The money they'd stolen from me was apparently just the beginning of a much larger pattern of fraud. My phone started buzzing with notifications faster than I could read them. Text messages, missed calls, Facebook messages, Instagram comments, and voicemails were coming in continuously. The story was spreading beyond our immediate community as people shared it with friends and family in other states. Then I saw the phone number I'd been dreading Jake was calling. My finger hesitated over the decline button, but something made me answer. "Cecelia." His voice was barely above a whisper. "What have you done?" My phone became completely unusable within minutes of Jake's call. The notification sounds were constant and overwhelming. Hundreds of calls, text messages, social media notifications, and voicemails pouring in faster than the device could process them. I had to turn off all sounds and put it in airplane mode just to think clearly. When I finally turned it back on an hour later, I found over 300 missed calls and more than 1,000 text messages. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years were calling to apologize and express their outrage. High school classmates were reaching out to say they'd always wondered why I'd disappeared from family events. Even neighbors from my childhood were sending messages of support. But the call that changed everything came from Angela Martinez, the local news reporter who had contacted me earlier. "Cecelia, I need you to understand how significant this story has become. Gerald Morrison's construction company, Morrison & Sons Construction, has been under federal investigation for over 18 months. They've been systematically overcharging the government for veteran housing projects and military family housing developments." She explained that the FBI had been building a case against Gerald's company for defrauding the Department of Veterans Affairs out of millions of dollars. The construction contracts were supposed to provide affordable quality housing for military families and disabled veterans, but investigators suspected that Gerald had been using substandard materials while charging premium prices. "The problem is that white-collar crime cases require establishing a pattern of fraudulent character and intent," Angela continued. "Your recording provides the first clear evidence that Gerald Morrison is willing to steal money from vulnerable people for personal gain. The FBI has been looking for exactly this kind of character evidence." My hands started shaking as I realized the implications. The man who had stolen my inheritance and emotionally abused me for decades had apparently been stealing from veterans and military families. The scope of his criminal behavior was far beyond what I'd imagined. Within minutes of our conversation, FBI Special Agent Robert Chen contacted me directly. His first question caught me completely off guard. "Ms. Morrison, were you aware that your biological father, Michael Chen, was my cousin?" The world seemed to stop spinning. Agent Chen explained that the extended Chen family had been looking for me since I turned 18. Michael's parents? My biological grandparents were still alive and had been trying to locate me through various channels for over a decade. Patricia and Gerald had apparently been intercepting and discarding any letters or contact attempts from my biological family. "Your grandparents never stopped believing that something wasn't right about your adoption circumstances," Agent Chen said. "They hired private investigators multiple times over the years, but Patricia and Gerald had legal guardianship, and there was no evidence of wrongdoing at the time." He informed me that the federal investigation into Gerald's company had uncovered financial records showing personal expenditures that didn't match his reported income. Jake's expensive private school education, luxury family vacations, and the family's lavish lifestyle had all been funded through inflated government contracts. "We estimate that Gerald Morrison has defrauded the federal government of over $4 million in the past 8 years alone," Agent Chen continued. "Your trust fund theft establishes a clear pattern of financial crime dating back decades. This could be the evidence we need to move forward with federal charges." As we spoke, I could see my social media notifications continuing to explode. The story had been picked up by regional news outlets and was spreading across multiple states. Veterans organizations were sharing the post and expressing outrage that their housing funds had potentially been stolen by the same man who had robbed an orphan child. The American Legion posted a statement on their official page. "If these allegations against Morrison & Sons Construction are true, Gerald Morrison has stolen from the most vulnerable members of our community, orphan children and homeless veterans. We demand a full investigation and prosecution to the fullest extent of the law." Local veterans started commenting on my original post with their own experiences with Gerald's company. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez shared that her family had been given substandard housing that required thousands of dollars in immediate repairs after they moved in. Corporal James Thompson revealed that his disabled accessible modifications had been installed incorrectly and had to be completely redone by another contractor at his own expense. But the most heartbreaking comment came from Senior Airman Lisa Davis, who explained that her family had been displaced from their home during construction that was supposed to take 6 weeks but stretched to 6 months due to material delays. She'd later discovered that Gerald's company had been juggling multiple military contracts simultaneously and using cheaper materials than specified in the government contracts. Jake called me 15 more times throughout the afternoon. When I finally answered, he was crying. "Cecelia, I swear I didn't know about the trust fund. I didn't know they were lying to the family about you. I thought you really were having problems and didn't want to be around us." His voice broke as he continued. "But I can't say I didn't benefit from it. My education, my car, our family vacations, if they used your money for that, then I've been living off stolen funds my entire life." Jake revealed details that made my stomach turn. Gerald had been grooming him to take over the family business since he was 12 years old, but Jake had started noticing irregularities in the company books over the past 2 years. Invoices that didn't match actual work performed materials charged to government contracts that were never delivered to job sites, and subcontractors who were paid significantly less than what was billed to the government. "I thought Dad was just cutting corners to maximize profit," Jake admitted. "I didn't realize he was committing federal crimes. And I had no idea about what they did to you. The way Mom talked about you, I thought you were genuinely unstable and potentially dangerous." Family friends who had known us for decades started cutting ties with Patricia and Gerald publicly on social media. The pastor of our family church posted a statement saying that Patricia and Gerald would no longer be welcome in leadership positions pending a full investigation of the allegations. Dr. Harrison Mills, the family physician who had supposedly diagnosed me with various mental health conditions, posted a professional statement clarifying that he had never treated me and had no record of ever meeting me. "Any medical documents bearing my signature regarding Cecelia Morrison are fraudulent. I will be cooperating fully with any investigation into the creation of false medical records." By evening, the local police had contacted me about filing formal charges for the trust fund theft. Detective Sarah Coleman explained that while some of the financial crimes might be beyond the statute of limitations, the creation of false medical records and defamation of character were ongoing crimes that could still be prosecuted. As the day ended, I realized that my simple decision to upload a recording had exposed a criminal enterprise that had been operating in our community for decades. Gerald Morrison wasn't just an abusive adoptive father, he was apparently a career criminal who had been stealing from some of the most vulnerable people in America. My phone buzzed with one more message, this time from my biological grandfather. "Cecelia, this is David Chen, your father's father. We have been looking for you for so many years. We love you and we want you to come home." The next morning brought a phone call that would change my understanding of everything. Thomas Brennan, a lawyer who had been practicing family law for over 30 years, contacted me after seeing the viral video. His voice was filled with regret and anger as he introduced himself. "Cecelia, I was the attorney who handled your biological parents' estate after their death 25 years ago. I've been trying to reach your family for years, but Patricia and Gerald Morrison told me repeatedly that you didn't want any contact with your biological family's legacy." My heart stopped. Thomas explained that there had been much more to my biological parents' will than Patricia and Gerald had ever revealed. Rebecca and Michael Chen had left detailed instructions for my care that went far beyond the financial trust fund. They had specifically requested that I be told stories about them every year on my birthday, that I receive copies of family photographs, and that I be given letters they had written for me to read at different ages. Your parents wrote you 12 letters, Thomas said, his voice breaking slightly. One for each birthday from age 5 through 16. They wanted you to know about their love, their hopes for your future, and your family history. Patricia and Gerald assured me they were following these instructions, but apparently they never gave you any of it. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Thomas informed me that my biological parents had established a second trust fund with a completely different bank, one that Patricia and Gerald had never reported to me. This fund, which had been earning interest for 25 years, now contained $89,000. I've been the trustee of this account since your parents' death, Thomas explained. The instructions were that you should receive access to it on your 25th birthday, but when I tried to contact your family 3 years ago, Gerald told me you were struggling with mental health issues and weren't ready to handle financial responsibility. Thomas had tried multiple times over the years to maintain contact with my adoptive family, but Patricia and Gerald had systematically lied to him about my well-being and my wishes. They had told him I was in and out of psychiatric facilities, that I had requested no contact with my biological family's legacy, and that any attempts to reach me would be harmful to my recovery. I should have tried harder to reach you directly, Thomas said, his voice filled with guilt. But they were your legal guardians, and I had no reason to suspect they were lying about your well-being. He arranged to meet me that afternoon and brought a box of materials that Patricia and Gerald had kept hidden from me for over 2 decades. Inside were hundreds of photographs of my biological parents' extended family members I'd never met, and documentation of my family history dating back generations. The letters from my parents were the most beautiful and heartbreaking things I'd ever read. Each one was filled with love, wisdom, and specific hopes for who I would become. They wrote about their dreams for my education, their hopes that I would find meaningful work that helped others, and their desire that I would always know how much they loved me. My father's letter for my 16th birthday read, "Cecelia, if you're reading this, it means your mother and I are no longer with you, but our love continues to surround you every day. We hope you know that you were the greatest joy of our lives. We hope you're curious about the world, kind to others who are struggling, and brave enough to stand up for what's right." My mother's letter for my 18th birthday contained advice about choosing a career, finding love, and building a family of your own. Remember that true family isn't just about blood relations. It's about people who love you unconditionally and support your dreams. We hope you found that kind of family, and if you haven't yet, please don't give up hope. While Thomas and I were meeting, my social media post continued to gain momentum. Extended family members who had been kept away from me for years started organizing support in ways I never could have imagined. My cousins Emma and David created a legal fund to help cover my court costs for pursuing charges against Patricia and Gerald. Within 24 hours, relatives contributed over $15,000 to support my case. Emma posted an update saying, "Cecelia has been stolen from twice, first her parents, then her inheritance. We won't let her be stolen from again." The local veterans organization American Legion Post 247 contacted me directly to express their support. Commander William Torres explained that several of their members had been affected by Gerald's substandard construction work, and they wanted to help with the federal investigation. "What Gerald Morrison did to you as a child is exactly the same thing he's been doing to veterans and their families," Commander Torres said. "He finds vulnerable people and takes advantage of their trust. Veterans who are dealing with disabilities and trauma shouldn't have to worry about their contractor stealing from them." 3 employees from Gerald's construction company reached out to me privately through social media. They revealed that they had been documenting questionable practices for months, but were afraid to come forward because Gerald had threatened to blacklist them from the construction industry if they ever spoke against him. Foreman Carlos Medina shared photographs of materials that were supposed to be used in veteran housing projects, but were instead diverted to Gerald's personal property improvements. Electrician Shannon Walsh provided copies of invoices showing that Gerald charged the government for premium copper wiring, but actually installed much cheaper aluminum alternatives in veteran housing units. Project manager Ashley Ford revealed the most damning evidence Gerald had been creating fake subcontractor companies to inflate costs and justify higher government payments. He would create a shell company, bill the government for work that was never done, then pocket the difference. Some of these fake companies were supposedly owned by disabled veterans to qualify for minority contractor bonuses. The local media coverage intensified as more evidence emerged. Channel 7 News ran a special investigation highlighting the connection between my family's financial abuse and the broader pattern of veteran fraud. The story was picked up by regional and national news outlets as an example of systemic fraud affecting vulnerable communities, but perhaps the most meaningful support came from my biological family. My grandfather, David Chen, called me that evening and spoke to me for 2 hours about my parents, their lives, and the family history I'd been denied for decades. "Your father was a teacher and your mother was a nurse," he explained. "They met in college and spent their early marriage doing volunteer work with disadvantaged children. They would be so proud of the courage you've shown in exposing this injustice." He revealed that the Chen family had established a scholarship fund in my parents' memory that had been helping other orphan children for 25 years. "We always hoped that someday we would find you and you could help us decide how to distribute these funds. Your parents would want their legacy to help other children who have faced similar challenges." As the day ended, I realized that exposing Patricia and Gerald's crimes had not only brought me justice, it had connected me with an entire community of people who had been looking out for me without my knowledge. For the first time in 25 years, I wasn't alone in my fight. Patricia and Gerald's response to the viral video was swift and vicious. Within 72 hours of my post going live, they had hired Preston Matthews and Associates, one of the most expensive law firms in Tennessee, to begin a counterattack designed to discredit everything I had revealed. Their strategy became clear when I received a certified letter claiming that I was having a psychotic break and needed immediate psychiatric intervention. The letter, signed by Dr. Harrison Mills, stated that I had a documented history of bipolar disorder, paranoid delusions, and violent tendencies that made me a danger to myself and others. The letter referenced psychiatric evaluations I had supposedly undergone between ages 16 and 22, during which I had allegedly been diagnosed with severe personality disorders and chronic delusional thinking patterns. According to these fabricated records, I had been in and out of psychiatric facilities for years and had recently stopped taking medications that were essential for my mental stability. Dr. Mills had apparently agreed to sign these false documents for a payment of $25,000. The plan, as I would later discover, was to have me involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility where I could be held for observation and potentially declared mentally incompetent. If successful, this would discredit my testimony and potentially allow them to gain control over the trust fund that Thomas Brennan was holding for me. The fabricated medical records were incredibly detailed and convincing. They included fake therapy session notes describing violent fantasies I had supposedly expressed, medication records for psychiatric drugs I had never taken, and hospital admission records for facilities I had never visited. Patricia had called Adult Protective Services on a Thursday morning, claiming that I was experiencing a complete mental breakdown and had made threats against family members. She provided the falsified medical records as evidence and requested immediate intervention. By Thursday afternoon, 2 police officers and a mental health crisis worker arrived at my apartment with documents authorizing an involuntary psychiatric hold. Officer Jennifer Martinez explained that they had received reports of concerning behavior and needed to conduct a welfare check. "We have documentation showing that you've been struggling with mental health issues and may be a danger to yourself or others," she said gently. "We need you to come with us for an evaluation." I felt my world collapsing around me. The false medical records looked completely legitimate, complete with official letterheads, medical license numbers, and detailed treatment histories. If not for the fact that I knew they were lies, I might have believed them myself. Fortunately, Thomas Brennan had anticipated exactly this kind of retaliation. When I called him in a panic, he revealed that he had already filed protective orders with the court system based on his concerns about Patricia and Gerald's behavior. "I've been practicing family law for 30 years, Thomas explained to the officers. "This kind of fabricated psychiatric evidence is a classic intimidation tactic used by abusive guardians when their financial crimes are exposed. I have documentation proving that these medical records are fraudulent." Thomas arrived at my apartment within 30 minutes, accompanied by Dr. Rebecca Lawson, a licensed psychiatrist who was willing to conduct an immediate evaluation to counter the false claims. Dr. Lawson's assessment confirmed that I showed no signs of mental illness, psychotic breaks, or dangerous behavior. But the most significant development came when Dr. Harrison Mills himself contacted the FBI that same evening. Apparently, the pressure of participating in such an elaborate fraud scheme had become too much for him, and he was hoping to negotiate immunity in exchange for cooperation. Dr. Mills revealed that Gerald Morrison had approached him 3 weeks earlier with a proposal to create false psychiatric records that could be used to discredit me. Gerald had offered $25,000 for Dr. Mills to sign documents claiming that I was mentally unstable and potentially dangerous. He told me that his adopted daughter was making false accusations about financial improprieties and that the family needed to protect themselves from her delusions, Dr. Mills explained to federal investigators. He said she had always been troubled and that this was just an escalation of long-standing mental health problems. Dr. Mills had initially refused, but Gerald had pressured him by threatening to report fabricated malpractice claims against him to the state medical board. The combination of financial pressure and intimidation had convinced Dr. Mills to participate in the scheme. What Dr. Mills didn't know was that the FBI had been monitoring Gerald's phone calls and financial transactions as part of the ongoing federal investigation into his construction company. Recording devices had captured Gerald and Patricia planning the entire false psychiatric commitment scheme. Special Agent Robert Chen played portions of these recordings for me the next day. Patricia's voice was clearly audible discussing the details. "If we can get her committed for 72 hours, that gives us time to petition for guardianship. Once she's declared mentally incompetent, anything she's said about us becomes the ramblings of a disturbed person." Gerald's response was even more chilling. "We should have done this years ago. Nobody questions the family when they're trying to help a mentally ill relative. It's the perfect cover." The recordings revealed that Patricia and Gerald had been using similar tactics for years to intimidate employees, business partners, and anyone who questioned their practices. They had an established pattern of creating false documentation and using intimidation to silence potential witnesses. This new evidence of witness intimidation and attempted fraud added federal charges to their growing legal problems. The attempted psychiatric commitment was classified as conspiracy to deprive civil rights under federal law, which carried potential prison sentences of up to 10 years. Jake finally reached his breaking point when he learned about his parents' attempt to have me falsely committed. He called me that evening sobbing and apologizing for years of believing their lies about my character. "I can't do this anymore," he said. "I can't pretend they're good people who made mistakes. They tried to have you locked up in a psychiatric hospital based on lies. That's not family dysfunction, that's criminal behavior." Jake announced publicly on social media that he was cutting ties with Patricia and Gerald and would be cooperating fully with federal investigators. His post was shared thousands of times within hours. "I was raised to believe that family loyalty meant protecting each other no matter what. I now understand that real family loyalty means protecting each other from people who would cause harm, even when those people are your parents." The media coverage exploded as the attempted psychiatric fraud became national news. Legal experts appeared on television to explain how this kind of fabricated mental health evidence was being used across the country to silence whistleblowers and abuse victims. Veterans organizations demanded congressional hearings on Gerald's military contract fraud, and several members of Congress issued statements calling for a comprehensive investigation into contractor fraud affecting veteran housing programs. Within a week of their counterattack attempt, Patricia and Gerald had all of their assets frozen pending the federal investigation. Gerald's construction company was suspended from all government contracts, and existing projects were transferred to other contractors to ensure that veteran families weren't further impacted. The FBI investigation into Gerald's construction business had been quietly expanding for months, but what they discovered during their deeper dive into his personal history would shock everyone involved. Detective Sarah Coleman, who had been working the financial fraud case, contacted me on a Tuesday morning with news that would change everything I thought I knew about my biological parents' death. "Cecelia, we need to talk. The investigation into Gerald Morrison has uncovered irregularities in the police report from the car accident that killed your biological parents 25 years ago." Detective Coleman met me at the police station that afternoon with a box of files that had been stored in the cold case archives. The original accident report from 1999 showed details that had been overlooked or deliberately suppressed during the initial investigation. The collision that killed Rebecca and Michael Chen hadn't been a simple accident caused by bad weather, as I'd always been told. The investigating officer's notes indicated evidence of brake tampering on their vehicle, but this information had never been followed up on or included in the official report. The original investigating officer, Detective Raymond Walsh, noted that the brake lines appeared to have been deliberately severed, Detective Coleman explained. But somehow this information was buried in the file and never pursued. Detective Walsh retired 6 months after your parents' accident and moved to Florida. Detective Coleman had contacted Detective Walsh, now 73 years old, to ask about the discrepancies in the case file. What Walsh revealed was that he had been pressured by his supervisor to classify the accident as weather-related and close the case quickly. Walsh told me that the supervisor who pressured him to drop the investigation was Lieutenant Frank Morrison, Gerald Morrison's older brother. Detective Coleman continued. Frank Morrison was promoted to police chief 2 years later and held that position until his retirement in 2010. The family connections ran even deeper than I had imagined. Gerald Morrison hadn't just been a family friend who stepped in to help an orphan child. He had apparently been connected to my parents' death from the beginning. Detective Coleman had also discovered inconsistencies in the hospital records from the night my parents died. Rebecca and Michael Chen had actually survived the initial car crash and were taken to St. Mary's Hospital in critical but stable condition. They died 12 hours later from what was officially listed as complications from their injuries. But a review of their medical records showed unusual medication errors during their treatment. Patricia Morrison had been working as a nurse in the intensive care unit at St. Mary's Hospital in 1999. She had been on duty during the entire time my parents were being treated. "We found 3 nurses who worked with Patricia that night," Detective Coleman said. "They all remember the case because it was unusual for 2 patients to die from medication errors on the same shift. Patricia was the primary nurse for both patients. One of those nurses, Mary Beth Curtis, had retired years ago, but still remembered the details clearly. Patricia administered medication to both patients around midnight," Curtis recalled. "About an hour later, both patients went into cardiac arrest. It was tragic, but these things sometimes happen with trauma patients." However, Curtis had always found it strange that Patricia had requested specifically to work with the car accident victims. Usually, nurses are assigned patients randomly, but Patricia asked to take care of those 2 specifically. She said she knew the family and wanted to make sure they received the best possible care. The toxicology reports from my parents' blood work that night showed lethal combinations of medications that should never have been administered together. Patricia had given them drug combinations that were guaranteed to cause cardiac arrest in patients with their types of injuries. "This wasn't a medical error," Detective Coleman explained. "This was deliberate murder disguised as treatment complications." But why would Patricia Morrison want to kill my biological parents? The answer lay in evidence that the FBI had uncovered during their investigation into Gerald's current business practices. Federal agents had obtained access to Gerald's personal financial records dating back 30 years. In early 1999, Gerald's construction business had been on the verge of bankruptcy. He owed over $200,000 to creditors and was facing foreclosure on both his business and personal properties. During this same time period, Gerald had been having an extramarital affair with my biological mother, Rebecca Chen. Rebecca had threatened to tell Patricia about the affair unless Gerald left his wife and married her instead. Rebecca had written several letters to Gerald demanding that he choose between his wife and her, Detective Coleman said, showing me copies of letters that had been found in Gerald's personal safe. She gave him an ultimatum to divorce Patricia by the end of March 1999, or she would expose the affair to his wife, his business partners, and his church community. Gerald's business depended heavily on contracts from the local church community and conservative business networks. A public affair and divorce scandal would have destroyed his reputation and finished his business permanently. But rather than choose between the women, Gerald had apparently decided to eliminate the problem entirely. The brake tampering on my parents' car had been his attempt to kill Rebecca and make it look like an accident. Michael's death would have been collateral damage that Gerald was apparently willing to accept. The plan had partially failed when my parents survived the initial crash, but Patricia had finished what Gerald started by murdering them in the hospital. The adoption of their 3-year-old daughter would provide the perfect cover story. Instead of being suspected murderers, they would be seen as heroic family friends who stepped in to care for a tragic orphan. "The theft of your trust fund wasn't just greed," Detective Coleman explained. "It was part of the cover-up. Gerald and Patricia needed to make sure you never had enough resources to investigate your parents' death or hire attorneys who might discover the truth." Cold case investigators had also located Patricia's former nursing colleagues, who had suspected her involvement in my parents' deaths 25 years ago. Nurse supervisor Margaret Rodriguez had documented her concerns about Patricia's behavior that night in her personal notes. "Patricia was unusually emotional about these particular patients," Rodriguez had written. "She kept talking about how tragic it was and how she felt personally responsible for making sure they were comfortable. Her level of investment seemed inappropriate for patients she claimed to barely know." Rodriguez had also noted that Patricia had been present in both patients' rooms when they went into cardiac arrest, despite being assigned to other patients at the time. She said she was just checking on them, but it was highly unusual for her to be monitoring patients who weren't officially her responsibility. DNA evidence preserved from the crash scene was finally submitted for modern testing. Gerald Morrison's DNA was found on the brake components of my parents' car, providing definitive proof that he had tampered with their vehicle. Within 48 hours of this discovery, federal agents arrested both Gerald and Patricia Morrison on charges of first-degree murder conspiracy to commit murder and obstruction of justice. The construction company fraud charges became secondary to the double homicide case. The local community was devastated to learn the truth about the family that had been considered pillars of their society for decades. The church where Gerald had served as a deacon for 20 years issued a statement expressing shock and offering support to the victims' families. Jake called me that evening completely broken. "Cecelia, I don't even know what to say. My parents murdered your parents and then spent 25 years stealing from you and lying about it. Everything I thought I knew about our family was built on murder and lies." The scope of Gerald and Patricia's criminal behavior was far beyond anything anyone had imagined. They weren't just abusive adoptive parents or white-collar criminals. They were murderers who had built their entire lives on a foundation of violence and deception. The trials of Patricia and Gerald Morrison became the most closely watched criminal proceedings in Tennessee state history. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. DNA evidence, recorded confessions, financial records, and testimony from dozens of witnesses created an undeniable picture of two people who had committed murder and spent decades covering it up through continued criminal behavior. Patricia Morrison was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder for the hospital deaths of Rebecca and Michael Chen. The jury found that her administration of lethal drug combinations was deliberate and premeditated. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gerald Morrison was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder for orchestrating the brake tampering that caused the initial car accident. He was also convicted on 17 federal counts of fraud related to his construction business practices, which had defrauded the government of over $4 million. His sentence was life without parole, plus 60 years for the federal charges. The construction business that had been too important for me to inherit was liquidated to compensate the veterans and military families who had been defrauded over the years. The proceeds were distributed through a victim compensation fund that provided restitution to over 150 families who had been affected by Gerald's substandard construction work. My own financial situation was completely transformed. Thomas Brennan helped me recover not only the original trust fund money that had been stolen, but also damages and interest that brought the total to over $400,000. The settlement from the wrongful death lawsuit against Patricia and Gerald's estate provided an additional $200,000. But rather than use this money for personal luxury, I felt compelled to honor my biological parents' memory in a meaningful way. I used the funds to establish the Rebecca and Michael Chen Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting adopted children and abuse survivors. The foundation provides legal assistance to adoptees who suspect financial abuse by their guardians, counseling services for children who have experienced trauma, and educational scholarships for young people aging out of the foster care system. Within 2 years, we were helping over 300 families annually across 5 states. My extended family, who had been manipulated and lied to for decades, made extraordinary efforts to welcome me back into their lives. Uncle Marcus and Aunt Susan organized a family reunion specifically to reintroduce me to cousins and relatives I hadn't seen in years. They created a photo album of every family event I had missed, with handwritten explanations of what had been happening in everyone's lives. Emma and David, the cousins who had organized the legal fund for my court costs, became my closest confidants and advisors for the foundation. They helped me understand family history and traditions I had been excluded from, and they made sure I felt included in every future gathering. The most meaningful reconciliation was with Jake. He underwent extensive therapy to process the trauma of learning that his parents were murderers and that his entire childhood had been built on stolen money and fabricated lies. He legally changed his last name from Morrison to Chen, honoring my biological parents, and donated his entire inheritance to the foundation. "I can't undo 25 years of believing lies about you," Jake told me during one of our weekly therapy sessions, "but I can spend the rest of my life making sure that other families don't get torn apart the way ours was." Jake became the foundation's director of family services, using his business background to help develop programs that support healthy adoptive relationships and prevent financial abuse of vulnerable children. Thomas Brennan helped me locate my biological family, and the reunion with my grandparents was one of the most emotional experiences of my life. David and Helen Chen had never stopped looking for me, and they had preserved every photograph, letter, and memento from my parents' lives. "Your mother would be so proud of the courage you've shown," my grandmother Helen told me during our first meeting. "She always said that the most important thing in life was standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves." My grandparents introduced me to an extended network of aunts, uncles, and cousins from my biological family who had been searching for me for decades. I learned that my parents had been deeply involved in charitable work and community service, and that helping others had been a central part of their identity. The scholarship fund that my biological family had maintained in my parents' memory became part of the foundation's educational programs. We were able to expand it significantly and provide full college scholarships to 25 students each year. The community recognition was both humbling and meaningful. The Tennessee State Legislature passed a resolution honoring my courage in exposing corruption that had affected veterans and military families. The American Legion presented me with their highest civilian award for service to veterans communities. Local veterans organizations credited my decision to speak out with saving millions of dollars in fraudulent contracts and protecting countless military families from substandard housing. Commander William Torres of American Legion Post 247 said, "Cecelia Morrison's courage to expose the truth didn't just bring justice for her own family, it protected every veteran family in our region from continued abuse." Dr. Harrison Mills, who had initially participated in the scheme to discredit me, lost his medical license and served 2 years in federal prison for conspiracy and fraud. However, his cooperation with investigators had been crucial in building the case against Gerald and Patricia, and he expressed genuine remorse for his actions. "I was intimidated and pressured into participating in something I knew was wrong," Dr. Mills said during his sentencing hearing. "Ms. Morrison showed more courage in one day than I showed in my entire career. I hope my cooperation helped bring her the justice she deserved." The most important outcome was the peace I finally found in understanding my identity and my family's true history. The letters my biological parents had written for each of my birthdays became a source of guidance and comfort as I navigated my new life. Their words of wisdom helped me make decisions about the foundation, my relationships, and my future. On my 29th birthday, I celebrated for the first time in my life, surrounded by people who truly loved and supported me. My biological grandparents, my adoptive family members who had been deceived for years, Jake and his new family, and the survivors we had helped through the foundation all came together to honor not just my birthday, but the journey that had brought us all together. The final celebration was reading the last letter my parents had written for me, intended for my 30th birthday. My mother's words seemed to speak directly to everything that had happened. Cecelia, if you're reading this, it means you've grown into the strong, compassionate woman we always knew you would become. We hope you've learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is tell the truth, even when it's difficult or scary. The world needs people who are brave enough to stand up for what's right. My father's final letter contained advice that had become the Foundation's motto. Remember that your greatest strength will always be your ability to turn your own pain into help for others. The challenges you've faced in life aren't just obstacles to overcome, they're tools you can use to help other people find their way through similar struggles. As I concluded this chapter of my life, I realized that standing up to Gerald and Patricia Morrison had done more than just bring me justice. It had exposed a criminal enterprise, protected vulnerable veterans and military families, reunited me with my biological family, and created a foundation that would help thousands of children and families for generations to come. Sometimes the family that hurts you most is hiding the darkest secrets, and finding your voice to expose the truth can heal not just yourself, but an entire community. The courage to upload that video didn't just change my life, it changed the lives of everyone who had been silenced, stolen from, or lied to by people they trusted. My story became proof that one person's decision to speak truth to power can create ripples of justice that extend far beyond what anyone could imagine. The 3-year-old girl who had lost her parents in what seemed like a tragic accident had grown into a woman who could finally give them the justice they deserved. Thank you for listening to my journey and for understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to choose between protecting yourself and exposing the truth about people you cared about? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about how we can support each other through these difficult decisions. If this story resonated with you, please like this video to help others find it. Subscribe for more stories about courage and justice, and share it with anyone who might need to know that their voice matters. Together, we can create a world where truth and justice prevail and where no one has to suffer in silence. Wishing you the courage to speak your truth and the strength to build the life you deserve.